Section 17 of Tongues of Conscience by Robert Hitchens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Reichert. How Love Came to Professor Guildea, Part 3. Father Murchison was so busy a man that he had little time for brooding over the affairs of others. During Guildea's week at the sea, however, the father thought about him a great deal, with much wonder and some dismay. The dismay was soon banished, for the mild-eyed priest was quick to discern weakness in himself, quicker still to drive it forth as a most undesirable inmate of the soul. But the wonder remained. It was destined to a crescendo. Guildea had left London on a Thursday. On a Thursday he returned, having previously sent a note to Father Murchison to mention that he was leaving Westgate at a certain time. When his train ran into Victoria Station at 5 o'clock in the evening, he was surprised to see the cloaked figure of his friend standing upon the grey platform behind a line of porters. "What, Murchison," he said, "you here? Have you seceded from your orders that you are taking this holiday?" They shook hands. "No," said the father. "It happened that I had to be in this neighbourhood today, visiting a sick person, so I thought I would meet you." "And see if I were still a sick person, eh?" The professor glanced at him kindly, but with a dry little laugh. "Are you?" replied the father gently, looking at him with interest. "No, I think not. You appear very well." The sea air had, in fact, put some brownish red into Guildea's always thin cheeks. His keen eyes were shining with life and energy, and he walked forward in his loose grey suit and fluttering overcoat with a vigour that was noticeable, carrying easily in his left hand his well-filled Gladstone bag. The father felt completely reassured. "I never saw you look better," he said. "I never was better. Have you an hour to spare?" "2." "Good. I'll send my bag up by cab, and we'll walk across the park to my house and have a cup of tea there. What do you say?" "I shall enjoy it." They walked out of the station yard, past the flower girls and newspaper sellers, towards Grosvenor Place. "And you have had a pleasant time?" the father said. "Pleasant enough, and lonely. I left my companion behind me in the passage at number 100, you know." "And you'll not find him there now, I feel sure." Ejaculated Guildea. "What a precious weakling you think me, Murchison." As he spoke, he strode forward more quickly, as if moved to emphasize his sensation of bodily vigour. "A weakling, no. But anyone who uses his brain as persistently as you do yours must require an occasional holiday." "And I required one very badly, eh?" "You required one, I believe." "Well, I've had it, and now we'll see." The evening was closing in rapidly. They crossed the road at Hyde Park Corner and entered the park, in which were a number of people going home from work, men in corduroy trousers caked with dried mud and carrying tin cans slung over their shoulders, and flat panniers in which lay their tools. Some of the younger ones talked loudly or whistled shrilly as they walked. "Until the evening," murmured Father Murchison to himself. "What?" asked Guildea. "I was only quoting the last words of the text, which seems written upon life, especially upon the life of pleasure. 'Man goeth forth to his work and to his labour.' Ah, those fellows are not half bad fellows to have in an audience. There were a lot of them at the lecture I gave when I first met you, I remember. One of them tried to heckle me. He had a red beard. Chaps with red beards are always hecklers. I laid him low on that occasion. Well, Murchison, and now we're going to see." "What?" "Whether my companion has departed." "Tell me, do you feel any expectation of again thinking something is there?" "How carefully you choose language. No, I merely wonder." "You have no apprehension?" "Not a scrap. But I confess to feeling curious." "Then the sea air hasn't taught you to recognize that the whole thing came from overstrain?" "No," said Guildea very dryly. He walked on in silence for a minute. Then he added, "You thought it would?" "I certainly thought it might." "Make me realize that I had a sickly, morbid, rotten imagination, eh? Come now, Murchison, why not say frankly that you packed me off to Westgate to get rid of what you considered an acute form of hysteria?" The father was quite unmoved by this attack. "Come now, Guildea," he retorted. "What did you expect me to think? I saw no indication of hysteria in you. I never have. One would suppose you the last man likely to have such a malady. But which is more natural, for me to believe in your hysteria, or in the truth of such a story as you told me?" "You have me there. No, I mustn't complain. Well, there's no hysteria about me now, at any rate." "And no stranger in your house, I hope." Father Murchison spoke the last words with earnest gravity, dropping the half-bantering tone which they had both assumed. "You take the matter very seriously, I believe," said Guildea, also speaking more gravely. "How else can I take it? You wouldn't have me laugh at it when you tell it me seriously." "No. If we find my visitor still in the house, I may even call upon you to exorcise it. But I first must do one thing." "And that is?" "Prove to you, as well as to myself, that it is still there." "That might be difficult," said the father, considerably surprised by Guildea's matter-of-fact tone. "I don't know. If it has remained in my house, I think I can find a means. And I shall not be at all surprised if it is still there, despite the Westgate air." In saying the last words, the Professor relapsed into his former tone of dry chaff. The father could not quite make up his mind whether Guildea was feeling unusually grave or unusually gay. As the two men drew near to Hyde Park Place, their conversation died away, and they walked forward silently in the gathering darkness. "Here we are," said Guildea at last. He thrust his key into the door, opened it, and let Father Murchison into the passage, following him closely and banging the door. "Here we are," he repeated in a louder voice. The electric light was turned on in anticipation of his arrival. He stood still and looked round. "We'll have some tea at once," he said. "Ah, Pitting." The pale butler, who had heard the door bang, moved gently forward from the top of the stairs that led to the kitchen, greeted his master respectfully, took his coat and Father Murchison's cloak, and hung them on 2 pegs against the wall. "All's right, Pitting? All's as usual?" said Guildea. "Quite so, sir." "Bring us up some tea to the library." "Yes, sir." Pitting retreated. Guildea waited till he had disappeared, then opened the dining-room door, put his head into the room and kept it there for a moment, standing perfectly still. Presently he drew back into the passage, shut the door, and said, "Let's go upstairs." Father Murchison looked at him inquiringly, but made no remark. They ascended the stairs and came into the library. Guildea glanced rather sharply round. A fire was burning on the hearth. The blue curtains were drawn. The bright gleam of the strong electric light fell on the long rows of books on the writing table, very orderly in consequence of Guildea's holiday, and on the uncovered cage of the parrot. Guildea went up to the cage. Napoleon was sitting humped up on his perch with his feathers ruffled. His long toes, which looked as if they were covered with crocodile skin, clung to the bar. His round and blinking eyes were filmy, like old eyes. Guildea stared at the bird very hard, and then clucked with his tongue against his teeth. Napoleon shook himself, lifted one foot, extended his toes, sidled along the perch to the bars nearest to the Professor, and thrust his head against them. Guildea scratched it with his forefinger 2 or 3 times, still gazing attentively at the parrot. Then he returned to the fire just as Pitting entered with the tea-tray. Father Murchison was already sitting in an armchair on one side of the fire. Guildea took another chair and began to pour out tea, as Pitting left the room, closing the door gently behind him. The father sipped his tea, found it hot, and set the cup down on a little table at his side. "You're fond of that parrot, aren't you?" he asked his friend. "Not particularly. It's interesting to study sometimes. The parrot mind and nature are peculiar." "How long have you had him?" "About 4 years. I nearly got rid of him just before I made your acquaintance. I'm very glad now I kept him." "Are you? Why is that?" "I shall probably tell you in a day or 2. The father took his cup again. He did not press Guildea for an immediate explanation, but when they had both finished their tea, he said, "Well, has the sea air had the desired effect?" "No," said Guildea. The father brushed some crumbs from the front of his cassock and sat up higher in his chair. "Your visitor is still here?" he asked, and his blue eyes became more ungentle and piercing as he gazed at his friend. "Yes," answered Guildea calmly. "How do you know it? When did you know it? When you looked into the dining room just now?" "No, not until I came into this room. It welcomed me here." "Welcomed you? In what way?" "Simply by being here, by making me feel that it was here, as I might feel that a man was if I came into the room when it was dark." He spoke quietly, with perfect composure, in his usual dry manner. "Very well," the father said. "I shall not try to contend against your sensation, or to explain it away. Naturally, I am in amazement." "So am I. Never has anything in my life surprised me so much. Murchison, of course I cannot expect you to believe more than that I honestly suppose, imagine, if you like, that there is some intruder here, of what kind I am totally unaware. I cannot expect you to believe that there really is anything. If you were in my place, I in yours, I should certainly consider you the victim of some nervous delusion. I could not do otherwise. But wait, don't condemn me as a hysteria patient or as a madman for 2 or 3 days. I feel convinced that, unless I am indeed unwell, a mental invalid, which I don't think is possible, I shall be able very shortly to give you some proof that there is a newcomer in my house." "You don't tell me what kind of proof?" "Not yet. Things must go a little farther first. But perhaps even tomorrow I may be able to explain myself more fully. In the meantime I'll say this, that if, eventually, I can't bring any kind of proof that I'm not dreaming, I'll let you take me to any doctor you like, and I'll resolutely try to adopt your present view, that I'm suffering from an absurd delusion. That is your view, of course." Father Murchison was silent for a moment. Then he said, rather doubtfully, "It ought to be." "But isn't it?" asked Guildea, surprised. "Well, you know, your manner is enormously convincing. Still, of course, I doubt. How can I do otherwise? The whole thing must be fancy." The father spoke as if he were trying to recoil from a mental position he was being forced to take up. "It must be fancy," he repeated. "I'll convince you by more than my manner, or I'll not try to convince you at all," said Guildea. When they parted that evening, he said, "I'll write you in a day or 2, probably. I think the proof I am going to give you has been accumulating during my absence, but I shall soon know." Father Murchison was extremely puzzled as he sat on the top of the omnibus going homeward. End of section 17. Section 18 of Tongues of Conscience by Robert Hitchens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Reichert. How Love Came to Professor Guildea, Part 4. In 2 days' time he received a note from Guildea asking him to call, if possible, the same evening. This he was unable to do, as he had an engagement to fulfill at some East End gathering. The following day was Sunday. He wrote saying he would come on Monday, and got a wire shortly afterwards. "Yes, Monday. Come to dinner, 7:30, Guildea." At 7:30 he stood on the doorstep of number 100. Pitting let him in. "Is the Professor quite well, Pitting?" the father inquired as he took off his cloak. "I believe so, sir. He has not made any complaint," the butler formally replied. "Will you come upstairs, sir?" Guildea met them at the door of the library. He was very pale and sombre, and shook hands carelessly with his friend. "Give us dinner," he said to Pitting. As the butler retired, Guildea shut the door rather cautiously. Father Murchison had never before seen him look so disturbed. "You're worried, Guildea," the father said, "seriously worried." "Yes, I am. This business is beginning to tell on me a good deal." "Your belief in the presence of something here continues, then?" "Oh dear, yes. There's no sort of doubt about the matter. The night I went across the road into the park, something got into the house, though what the devil it is I can't yet find out. But now, before we go down to dinner, I'll just tell you something about that proof I promised you. You remember?" "Naturally." "Can't you imagine what it might be?" Father Murchison moved his head to express a negative reply. "Look about the room," said Guildea. "What do you see?" The father glanced round the room, slowly and carefully. "Nothing unusual. You do not mean to tell me there is any appearance of—" "Oh, no, no. There's no conventional, white-robed, cloud-like figure. Bless my soul, no. I haven't fallen so low as that." He spoke with considerable irritation. "Look again." Father Murchison looked at him. turned in the direction of his fixed eyes, and saw the grey parrot clambering in his cage, slowly and persistently. "What?" he said quickly. "Will the proof come from there?" The Professor nodded. "I believe so," he said. "Now let's go down to dinner. I want some food badly." They descended to the dining room. While they ate and Pitting waited upon them, the Professor talked about birds, their habits, their curiosities, their fears, and their powers of imitation. He had evidently studied this subject with the thoroughness that was characteristic of him in all that he did. "Parrots," he said presently, "are extraordinarily observant. It is a pity that their means of reproducing what they see are so limited. If it were not so, I have little doubt that their echo of gesture would be as remarkable as their echo of voice often is." "But hands are missing." "Yes, they do many things with their heads, however. I once knew an old woman near Goring on the Thames. She was afflicted with the palsy. She held her head perpetually sideways, and it trembled, moving from right to left. Her sailor son brought her home a parrot from one of his voyages. It used to reproduce the old woman's palsied movement of the head exactly. Those grey parrots are always on the watch." Guildea said the last sentence slowly and deliberately, glancing sharply over his wine at Father Murchison, and when he had spoken it, a sudden light of comprehension dawned in the priest's mind. He opened his lips to make a swift remark. Guildea turned his bright eyes towards Pitting, who at the moment was tenderly bearing a cheese meringue from the lift that connected the dining room with the lower regions. The father closed his lips again, but presently, when the butler had placed some apples on the table, and meticulously arranged the decanters, brushed away the crumbs, and evaporated, he said quickly, "I begin to understand. You think Napoleon is aware of the intruder?" "I know it. He has been watching my visitant ever since the night of that visitant's arrival." Another flash of light came to the priest. "That was why you covered him with green baize one evening." "Exactly. An act of cowardice. His behaviour was beginning to grate upon my nerves." Guildea pursed up his thin lips and drew his brows down, giving to his face a look of sudden pain. "But now I intend to follow his investigations," he added, straightening his features. "The week I wasted at Westgate was not wasted by him in London, I can assure you. Have an apple." "No, thank you. No, thank you." The father repeated the words without knowing that he did so. Guildea pushed away his glass. "Let us come upstairs, then." "No, thank you," reiterated the father. "Eh?" "What am I saying?" exclaimed the father, getting up. "I was thinking over this extraordinary affair." "Ah, you're beginning to forget the hysteria theory?" They walked out into the passage. "Well, you are so very practical about the whole matter." "Why not? Here's something very strange and abnormal come into my life. What should I do but investigate it closely and calmly?" What indeed? The father began to feel rather bewildered, under a sort of compulsion which seemed laid upon him to give earnest attention to a matter that ought to strike him, so he felt, as entirely absurd. When they came into the library, his eyes immediately turned, with profound curiosity, towards the parrot's cage. A slight smile curled the Professor's lips. He recognized the effect he was producing upon his friend. The father saw the smile. "Oh, I'm not won over yet," he said, in answer to it. "I know. Perhaps you may be before the evening is over. Here comes the coffee. After we have drunk it, we'll proceed to our experiment. Leave the coffee, Pitting, and don't disturb us again." "No, sir." "I won't have it black to-night," said the father. "Plenty of milk, please. I don't want my nerves played upon." "Suppose we don't take coffee at all," said Guildea. "If we do, you may trot out the theory that we are not in a perfectly normal condition. I know you, Murchison, devout priest and devout skeptic." The father laughed and pushed away his cup. "Very well, then. No coffee. One cigarette and then to business." The grey-blue smoke curled up. "What are we going to do?" said the father. He was sitting bolt upright as if ready for action. Indeed, there was no suggestion of repose in the attitude of either of the men. "Hide ourselves and watch Napoleon. By the way, that reminds me." He got up, went to a corner of the room, picked up a piece of green baize and threw it over the cage. "I'll pull that off when we are hidden." "And tell me first if you have had any manifestations of this supposed presence during the last few days?" "Merely an increasingly intense sensation of something here, perpetually watching me, perpetually attending to all my doings." "Do you feel that it follows you about?" "Not always. It was in this room when you arrived. It is here now, I feel. But in going down to dinner, we seemed to get away from it. The conclusion is that it remained here. Don't let us talk about it just now." They spoke of other things till their cigarettes were finished. Then, as they threw away the smouldering ends, Guildea said, "Now, Murchison, for the sake of this experiment, I suggest that we should conceal ourselves behind the curtains on either side of the cage, so that the bird's attention may not be drawn towards us, and so distracted from that which we want to know more about. I will pull away the green baize when we are hidden. Keep perfectly still, watch the bird's proceedings, and tell me afterwards how you feel about them, how you explain them. Tread softly." The father obeyed, and they stole towards the curtains that fell before the two windows. The father concealed himself behind those on the left of the cage, the Professor behind those on the right. The latter, as soon as they were hidden, stretched out his arm, drew the baize down from the cage, and let it fall on the floor. The parrot, which had evidently fallen asleep in the warm darkness, moved on its perch as the light shone upon it, ruffled the feathers round its throat, and lifted first one foot and then the other. It turned its head round on its supple and apparently elastic neck, and, diving its beak into the down upon its back, made some searching investigations with, as it seemed, a satisfactory result, for it soon lifted its head again, glanced around its cage, and began to address itself to a nut which had been fixed between the bars for its refreshment. With its curved beak it felt and tapped the nut, at first gently, then with severity. Finally it plucked the nut from the bars, seized it with its rough grey toes, and, holding it down firmly on the perch, cracked it and pecked out its contents, scattering some on the floor of the cage, and letting the fractured shell fall into the china bath that was fixed against the bars. This accomplished, the bird paused meditatively, extended one leg backwards, and went through an elaborate process of wing stretching that made it look as if it were lopsided and deformed. With its head reversed, it again applied itself to a subtle and exhaustive search among the feathers of its wing. This time its investigation seemed interminable, and Father Murchison had time to realize the absurdity of the whole position, and to wonder why he had lent himself to it. Yet he did not find his sense of humour laughing at it. On the contrary, he was smitten by a sudden gust of horror. When he was talking to his friend and watching him, the Professor's manner, generally so calm, even so prosaic, vouched for the truth of his story and the well-adjusted balance of his mind. But when he was hidden this was not so, and Father Murchison, standing behind his curtain, with his eyes upon the unconcerned Napoleon, began to whisper to himself the word "madness," with a quickening sensation of pity and of dread. The parrot sharply contracted one wing, ruffled the feathers around its throat again, then extended its other leg backwards, and proceeded to the cleaning of its other wing. In the still room the dry sound of the feathers being spread was distinctly audible. Father Murchison saw the blue curtains behind which Guildea stood tremble slightly, as if a breath of wind had come through the window they shrouded. The clock in the far room chimed, and a coal dropped into the grate, making a noise like dead leaves stirring abruptly on hard ground. And again a gust of pity and of dread swept over the father. It seemed to him that he had behaved very foolishly, if not wrongly, in encouraging what must surely be the strange dementia of his friend. He ought to have declined to lend himself to a proceeding that, ludicrous, even childish in itself, might well be dangerous in the encouragement it gave to a diseased expectation. Napoleon's protruding leg, extended wing and twisted neck, his busy and unconscious devotion to the arrangement of his person, his evident sensation of complete loneliness, most comfortable solitude, brought home with vehemence to the father the undignified buffoonery of his conduct, the more piteous buffoonery of his friend. He seized the curtains with his hands and was about to thrust them aside and issue forth when an abrupt movement of the parrot stopped him. The bird, as if sharply attracted by something, paused in its pecking, and with its head still bent backwards and twisted sideways on its neck, seemed to listen intently. Its round eye looked glistening and strained like the eye of a disturbed pigeon. Contracting its wing, it lifted its head and sat for a moment erect on its perch, shifting its feet mechanically up and down, as if a dawning excitement produced in it an uncontrollable desire of movement. Then it thrust its head forward in the direction of the further room, and remained perfectly still. Its attitude so strongly suggested the concentration of its attention on something immediately before it, that Father Murchison instinctively stared about the room, half expecting to see Pitting advance softly, having entered through the door. He did not come, and there was no sound in the chamber. Nevertheless, the parrot was obviously getting excited and increasingly attentive. It bent its head lower and lower, stretching out its neck until, almost falling from the perch, it half extended its wings, raising them slightly from its back, as if about to take flight, and fluttering them rapidly up and down. It continued this fluttering movement for what seemed to the father an immense time. At length, raising its wings as far as possible, it dropped them slowly and deliberately down to its back, caught hold of the edge of its bath with its beak, hoisted itself onto the floor of the cage, waddled to the bars, thrust its head against them, and stood quite still in the exact attitude it always assumed when its head was being scratched by the Professor. So complete was the suggestion of this delight conveyed by the bird that Father Murchison felt as if he saw a white finger gently pushed among the soft feathers of its head, and he was seized by a most strong conviction that something, unseen by him but seen and welcomed by Napoleon, stood immediately before the cage. The parrot presently withdrew its head, as if the coaxing finger had been lifted from it, and its pronounced air of acute physical enjoyment faded into one of marked attention and alert curiosity. Pulling itself up by the bars, it climbed again upon its perch, sidled to the left side of the cage, and began apparently to watch something with profound interest. It bowed its head oddly, paused for a moment, then bowed its head again. Father Murchison found himself conceiving, from this elaborate movement of the head, a distinct idea of a personality. The bird's proceedings suggested extreme sentimentality, combined with that sort of weak determination which is often the most persistent. Such weak determination is a very common attribute of persons who are partially idiotic. Father Murchison was moved to think of these poor creatures who will often so strangely and unreasonably attach themselves with persistence to those who love them least. Like many priests, he had had some experience of them, for the amorous idiot is peculiarly sensitive to the attraction of preachers. This bowing movement of the parrot recalled to his memory a terrible, pale woman who for a time haunted all churches in which he ministered, who was perpetually endeavouring to catch his eye, and who always bent her head with an obsequious and cunningly conscious smile when she did so. The parrot went on bowing, making a short pause between each genuflection, as if it waited for the signal to be given that called into play its imitative faculty. Yes, it's imitating an idiot, Father Murchison caught himself saying as he watched. A lovesick idiot. And he looked again about the room, but saw nothing, except the furniture, the dancing fire, and the serried ranks of the books. Presently the parrot ceased from bowing, and assumed the concentrated and stretched attitude of one listening very keenly. He opened his beak, showing his black tongue, shut it, then opened it again. The father thought he was going to speak, but he remained silent, although it was obvious that he was trying to bring out something. He bowed again 2 or 3 times, paused, and then again, opening his beak, made some remark. The father could not distinguish any words, but the voice was sickly and disagreeable, a cooing and at the same time querulous voice, like a woman's, he thought. And he put his ear nearer to the curtain, listening with almost feverish attention. The bowing was resumed, but this time Napoleon, adding to it a sidling movement, affectionate and affected, like the movement of a silly and eager thing, nestling up to someone or giving someone a gentle and furtive nudge. Again the father thought of that terrible, pale woman who had haunted churches. Several times he had come upon her waiting for him after evening services. Once she had hung her head smiling and lolled out her tongue and pushed against him sideways in the dark. He remembered how his flesh had shrunk from the poor thing, the sick loathing of her that he could not banish by remembering that her mind was all astray. The parrot paused, listened, opened its beak, and again said something in the same dove-like amorous voice, full of sickly suggestion and yet hard, even dangerous in its intonation. A loathsome voice, the father thought it. But this time, although he heard the voice more distinctly than before, he could not make up his mind whether it was like a woman's voice or a man's, or perhaps a child's. It seemed to be a human voice, and yet oddly sexless. In order to resolve his doubt, he withdrew into the darkness of the curtains, ceased to watch Napoleon, and simply listened with keen attention, striving to forget that he was listening to a bird, and to imagine that he was overhearing a human being in conversation. After 2 or 3 minutes' silence, the voice spoke again, and at some length, apparently repeating several times an affectionate series of ejaculations with a cooing emphasis that was unutterably mawkish and offensive. The sickliness of the voice, its falling intonations and its strange indelicacy, combined with a die-away softness and meretricious refinement, made the father's flesh creep. Yet he could not distinguish any words, nor could he decide on the voice's sex or age. One thing alone he was certain of, as he stood still in the darkness, that such a sound could only proceed from something peculiarly loathsome, could only express a personality unendurably abominable to him, if not to everybody. The voice presently failed in a sort of husky gasp, and there was a prolonged silence. It was broken by the Professor, who suddenly pulled away the curtains that hid the father and said to him, "Come out now and look." The father came into the light, blinking, glanced towards the cage, and saw Napoleon poised motionless on one foot, with his head under his wing. He appeared to be asleep. The Professor was pale, and his mobile lips were drawn into an expression of supreme disgust. "Faugh!" he said. He walked to the windows of the further room, pulled aside the curtains and pushed the glass up, letting in the air. The bare trees were visible in the grey gloom outside. Guildea leaned out for a minute, drawing the night air into his lungs. Presently he turned round to the father and exclaimed abruptly, "Pestilent, isn't it?" "Yes, most pestilent." "Ever hear anything like it?" "Not exactly." "Nor I. It gives me nausea, Murchison. Absolute physical nausea." He closed the window and walked uneasily about the room. "What do you make of it?" he asked over his shoulder. "How do you mean exactly?" "Is it man's, woman's, or child's voice?" "I can't tell. I can't make up my mind." "Nor I." "Have you heard it often?" "Yes, since I returned from Westgate. There are never any words that I can distinguish. What a voice!" He spat into the fire. "Forgive me," he said, throwing himself down in a chair. "It turns my stomach, literally." "And mine," said the father, truly. "The worst of it is," continued Guildea, with a high nervous accent, "that there's no brain with it, none at all, only the cunning of idiocy." The father started at this exact expression of his own conviction by another. "Why do you start like that?" asked Guildea, with a quick suspicion which showed the unnatural condition of his nerves. "Well, the very same idea had occurred to me." "What?" "That I was listening to the voice of something idiotic." "Ah, that's the devil of it, you know, to a man like me. I could fight against brain, but this—" He sprang up again, poked the fire violently, then stood on the hearthrug with his back to it and his hands thrust into the high pockets of his trousers. "That's the voice of the thing that's got into my house. Pleasant, isn't it?" And now there was real horror in his eyes and in his voice. "I must get it out," he exclaimed. "I must get it out. But how?" He tugged at his short black beard with a quivering hand. "How?" he continued. "For what is it? Where is it?" "You feel it's here, now?" "Undoubtedly. But I couldn't tell you in what part of the room." He stared about, glancing rapidly at everything. "Then you consider yourself haunted?" said Father Murchison. He too was much moved and disturbed, although he was not conscious of the presence of anything near them in the room. "I have never believed in any nonsense of that kind, as you know," Guildea answered. "I simply state a fact which I cannot understand. and which is beginning to be very painful to me. There is something here, but whereas most so-called hauntings have been described to me as inimical, what I am conscious of is that I am admired, loved, desired. This is distinctly horrible to me, Murchison, distinctly horrible." Father Murchison suddenly remembered the first evening he had spent with Guildea, and the latter's expression almost of disgust at the idea of receiving warm affection from anyone. In the light of that long-ago conversation, the present event seemed supremely strange, and almost like a punishment for an offence committed by the Professor against humanity. But looking up at his friend's twitching face, the father resolved not to be caught in the net of his hideous belief. "There can be nothing here," he said. "It's impossible." "What does that bird imitate, then?" "The voice of someone who has been here." "Within the last week, then? For it never spoke like that before, and mind, I noticed that it was watching and striving to imitate something before I went away, since the night that I went into the park, only since then." "Somebody with a voice like that must have been here while you were away," Father Murchison repeated with a gentle obstinacy. "I'll soon find out." Guildea pressed the bell. Pitting stole in almost immediately. "Pitting," said the Professor, speaking in a high, sharp voice, "did anyone come into this room during my absence at the sea?" "Certainly not, sir, except the maids, and me, sir." "Not a soul? You are certain?" "Perfectly certain, sir." The cold voice of the butler sounded surprised, almost resentful. The Professor flung out his hand towards the cage. "Has the bird been here the whole time?" "Yes, sir." "He was not moved, taken elsewhere, even for a moment?" Pitting's pale face began to look almost expressive, and his lips were pursed. "Certainly not, sir." "Thank you. That will do." The butler retired, moving with a sort of ostentatious rectitude. When he had reached the door and was just going out, his master called, "Wait a minute, Pitting." The butler paused. Guildea bit his lips, tugged at his beard uneasily 2 or 3 times, and then said, "Have you noticed the parrot talking lately in a very peculiar, very disagreeable voice?" "Yes, sir. A soft voice like, sir." "Ha! Since when?" "Since you went away, sir. He's always at it." "Exactly. Well, and what did you think of it?" "Beg pardon, sir?" "What do you think about his talking in this voice?" "Oh, that it's only his play, sir." "I see. That's all, Pitting." The butler disappeared and closed the door noiselessly behind him. Guildea turned his eyes on his friend. "There, you see!" he ejaculated. "It's certainly very odd," said the father. "Very odd indeed. You are certain you have no maid who talks at all like that?" "My dear Murchison, would you keep a servant with such a voice about you for 2 days?" "No." "My housemaid has been with me for 5 years, my cook for 7. You've heard Pitting speak. The 3 of them make up my entire household. A parrot never speaks in a voice it has not heard. Where has it heard that voice?" "But we hear nothing." "No, nor do we see anything. But it does. It feels something too. Didn't you observe it presenting its head to be scratched?" "Certainly it seemed to be doing so." "It was doing so." Father Murchison said nothing. He was full of increasing discomfort that almost amounted to apprehension. "Are you convinced?" said Guildea, rather irritably. "No, the whole matter is very strange. But till I hear, see, or feel, as you do, the presence of something, I cannot believe it." "You mean that you will not?" "Perhaps. Well, it is time I went." Guildea did not try to detain him, but said as he let him out, "Do me a favour. Come again tomorrow night." The father had an engagement. He hesitated, looked into the Professor's face, and said, "I will. At 9 I'll be with you. Good night." When he was on the pavement he felt relieved. He turned round, saw Guildea stepping into his passage, and shivered. End of section 18. Section 19 of Tongues of Conscience by Robert Hitchens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Reichert. How Love Came to Professor Guildea, Part 5. Father Murchison walked all the way home to Bird Street that night. He required exercise after the strange and disagreeable evening he had spent, an evening upon which he looked back already as a man looks back upon a nightmare. In his ears as he walked sounded the gentle and intolerable voice. Even the memory of it caused him physical discomfort. He tried to put it from him and to consider the whole matter calmly. The Professor had offered his proof that there was some strange presence in his house. Could any reasonable man accept such proof? Father Murchison told himself that no reasonable man could accept it. The parrot's proceedings were, no doubt, extraordinary. The bird had succeeded in producing an extraordinary illusion of an invisible presence in the room. But that there really was such a presence, the father insisted on denying to himself. The devoutly religious, those who believe implicitly in the miracles recorded in the Bible, and who regulate their lives by the messages they suppose themselves to receive directly from the great ruler of a hidden world, are seldom inclined to accept any notion of supernatural intrusion into the affairs of daily life. They put it from them with anxious determination. They regard it fixedly, as hocus-pocus, childish if not wicked. Father Murchison inclined to the normal view of the devoted churchman. He was determined to incline to it. He could not, so he told himself, accept the idea that his friend was being supernaturally punished for his lack of humanity, his deficiency in affection, by being obliged to endure the love of some horrible thing which could not be seen, heard, or handled. Nevertheless, retribution did certainly seem to wait upon Guildea's condition. That which he had unnaturally dreaded and shrunk from in his thought, he seemed to be now forced unnaturally to suffer. The father prayed for his friend that night before the little humble altar in the barely furnished, cell-like chamber where he slept. On the following evening, when he called in Hyde Park Place, the door was opened by the housemaid, and Father Murchison mounted the stairs, wondering what had become of Pitting. He was met at the library door by Guildea, and was painfully struck by the alteration in his appearance. His face was ashen in hue, and there were lines beneath his eyes. The eyes themselves looked excited and horribly forlorn. His hair and dress were disordered, and his lips twitched continually as if he were shaken by some acute nervous apprehension. "What has become of Pitting?" asked the father, grasping Guildea's hot and feverish hand. "He has left my service." "Left your service?" exclaimed the father in utter amazement. "Yes, this afternoon." "May one ask why?" "I'm going to tell you. It's all part and parcel of this most odious business. You remember once discussing the relations men ought to have with their servants?" "Ah!" cried the father, with a flash of inspiration. "The crisis has occurred?" "Exactly," said the Professor, with a bitter smile. "The crisis has occurred. I called upon Pitting to be a man and a brother. He responded by declining the invitation. I upbraided him. He gave me warning. I paid him his wages and told him he could go at once. And he has gone. What are you looking at me like that for?" "I didn't know," said Father Murchison, hastily dropping his eyes and looking away. "Why," he added, "Napoleon is gone too." "I sold him today to one of those shops in Shaftesbury Avenue." "Why?" "He sickened me with his abominable imitation of his intercourse with you know what he was at last night. Besides, I have no further need of his proof to tell me I am not dreaming. And being convinced as I now am that all I have thought to have happened has actually happened, I care very little about convincing others. Forgive me for saying so, Murchison, but I am now certain that my anxiety to make you believe in the presence of something here really arose from some faint doubt on that subject within myself. All doubt has now vanished." "Tell me why." "I will." Both men were standing by the fire. They continued to stand while Guildea went on. "Last night I felt it." "What?" cried the father. "I say that last night, as I was going upstairs to bed, I felt something accompanying me and nestling up against me." "How horrible!" exclaimed the father involuntarily. Guildea smiled drearily. I will not deny the horror of it. I cannot, since I was compelled to call on Pitting for assistance. But tell me, what was it? At least, what did it seem to be? It seemed to be a human being. It seemed, I say, and what I mean exactly is that the effect upon me was rather that of human contact than of anything else. But I could see nothing, hear nothing. Only 3 times I felt this gentle but determined push against me, as if to coax me and to attract my attention. The first time it happened, I was on the landing outside this room, with my foot on the first stair. I will confess to you, Murchison, that I bounded upstairs like one pursued. That is the shameful truth. Just as I was about to enter my bedroom, however, I felt the thing entering with me, and, as I have said, squeezing, with loathsome, sickening tenderness, against my side. Then he paused, turned towards the fire, and leaned his head on his arm. The father was greatly moved by the strange helplessness and despair of the attitude. He laid his hand affectionately on Guildea's shoulder. Then Guildea lifted his head. He looked painfully abashed. Then, Murchison, I am ashamed to say I broke down, suddenly, unaccountably, in a way I should have thought wholly impossible to me. I struck out with my hands to thrust the thing away. It pressed more closely to me. The pressure, the contact became unbearable to me. I shouted out for Pitting. I believe I must have cried, "Help!" He came, of course? Yes, with his usual soft, unemotional quiet, his calm. Its opposition to my excitement of disgust and horror must, I suppose, have irritated me. I was not myself. No. He stopped abruptly, then, "But I need hardly tell you that," he added with most piteous irony. "And what did you say to Pitting?" "I said that he should have been quicker. He begged my pardon. His cold voice really maddened me, and I burst out into some foolish, contemptible diatribe, called him a machine, taunted him, then, as I felt that loathsome thing nestling once more to me, begged him to assist me, to stay with me, not to leave me alone. I meant in the company of my tormentor. Whether he was frightened, or whether he was angry at my unjust and violent manner and speech a moment before, I don't know. In any case, he answered that he was engaged as a butler, and not to sit up all night with people. I suspect he thought I had taken too much to drink. No doubt that was it. I believe I swore at him as a coward. Aye. This morning he said he wished to leave my service. I gave him a month's wages, a good character as a butler, and sent him off at once." "But the night, how did you pass it?" "I sat up all night." "Where, in your bedroom?" "Yes, with the door open, to let it go." "You felt that it stayed?" "It never left me for a moment, but it did not touch me again. When it was light I took a bath, lay down for a little while, but did not close my eyes. After breakfast I had the explanation with Pitting and paid him. Then I came up here. My nerves were in a very shattered condition. Well, I sat down, tried to write, to think. But the silence was broken in the most abominable manner." "How?" "By the murmur of that appalling voice, that voice of a lovesick idiot, sickly but determined. Ugh!" He shuddered in every limb. Then he pulled himself together, assumed with a self-conscious effort his most determined, most aggressive manner, and added, "I couldn't stand that. I had come to the end of my tether, so I sprang up, ordered a cab to be called, seized the cage, and drove with it to a bird shop in Shaftesbury Avenue. There I sold the parrot for a trifle. I think, Murchison, that I must have been nearly mad then, for, as I came out of the wretched shop and stood for an instant on the pavement among the cages of rabbits, guinea pigs, and puppy dogs, I laughed aloud. I felt as if a load had lifted from my shoulders, as if in selling that voice I had sold the cursed thing that torments me. But when I got back to the house it was here. It's here now. I suppose it will always be here." He shuffled his feet on the rug in front of the fire. "What on earth am I to do?" he said. "I'm ashamed of myself, Murchison, but I suppose there are things in the world that certain men simply can't endure. Well, I can't endure this, and there's an end of the matter." He ceased. The father was silent. In presence of this extraordinary distress he did not know what to say. He recognized the uselessness of attempting to comfort Guildea, and he sat with his eyes turned almost moodily to the ground. And while he sat there, he tried to give himself to the influences within the room, to feel all that was within it. He even, half unconsciously, tried to force his imagination to play tricks with him, but he remained totally unaware of any third person with them. At length he said, "Guildea, I cannot pretend to doubt the reality of your misery here. You must go away, and at once. When is your Paris lecture?" "Next week, in 9 days from now." "Go to Paris tomorrow, then. You say you have never had any consciousness of this thing pursued you beyond your own front door?" "Never, hitherto." "Go tomorrow morning. Stay away till after your lecture, and then let us see if the affair is at an end. Hope, my dear friend, hope." He had stood up. Now he clasped the Professor's hand. "See all your friends in Paris. Seek distractions. I would ask you also to seek other help." He said the last words with a gentle, earnest gravity and simplicity that touched Guildea, who returned his hand clasp almost warmly. "I'll go," he said. "I'll catch the 10 o'clock train, and tonight I'll sleep at a hotel at the Grosvenor. That's close to the station. It will be more convenient for the train." As Father Murchison went home that night, he kept thinking of that sentence. It will be more convenient for the train. The weakness in Guildea that had prompted its utterance appalled him. End of section 19. Section 20 of Tongues of Conscience by Robert Hitchens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Reichert. How Love Came to Professor Guildea, Part 6. No letter came to Father Murchison from the Professor during the next few days, and this silence reassured him, for it seemed to betoken that all was well. The day of the lecture dawned and passed. On the following morning, the father eagerly opened the Times and scanned its pages to see if there were any report of the great meeting of scientific men which Guildea had addressed. He glanced up and down the columns with anxious eyes. Then suddenly his hands stiffened as they held the sheets. He had come upon the following paragraph. "We regret to announce that Professor Frederick Guildea was suddenly seized with severe illness yesterday evening while addressing a scientific meeting in Paris. It was observed that he looked very pale and nervous when he rose to his feet. Nevertheless, he spoke in French fluently for about a quarter of an hour. Then he appeared to become uneasy. He faltered and glanced about like a man apprehensive or in severe distress. He even stopped once or twice and seemed unable to go on, to remember what he wished to say. But pulling himself together with an obvious effort, he continued to address the audience. Suddenly, however, he paused again, edged furtively along the platform, as if pursued by something which he feared, struck out with his hands, uttered a loud, harsh cry, and fainted. The sensation in the hall was indescribable. People rose from their seats, women screamed, and for a moment there was a veritable panic. It is feared that the Professor's mind must have temporarily given way owing to overwork. We understand that he will return to England as soon as possible, and we sincerely hope that necessary rest and quiet will soon have the desired effect, and that he will be completely restored to health and enabled to prosecute further the investigations which have already so benefited the world. The father dropped the paper, hurried out into Bird Street, sent a wire of inquiry to Paris, and received the same day the following reply: "Returning tomorrow. Please call evening. Guildea." On that evening the father called in Hyde Park Place, was at once admitted, and found Guildea sitting by the fire in the library, ghastly pale, with a heavy rug over his knees. He looked like a man emaciated by a long and severe illness, and in his wide-open eyes there was an expression of fixed horror. The father started at the sight of him, and could scarcely refrain from crying out. He was beginning to express his sympathy when Guildea stopped him with a trembling gesture. "I know all that," Guildea said. "I know. This Paris affair—" He faltered and stopped. "You ought never to have gone," said the father. "I was wrong. I ought not to have advised your going. You were not fit." "I was perfectly fit," he answered, with the irritability of sickness. "But I was accompanied by that abominable thing." He glanced hastily round him, shifted his chair, and pulled the rug higher over his knees. The father wondered why he was thus wrapped up, for the fire was bright and red, and the night was not very cold. "I was accompanied to Paris," he continued, pressing his upper teeth upon his lower lip. He paused again, obviously striving to control himself, but the effort was vain. There was no resistance in the man. He writhed in his chair and suddenly burst forth in a tone of hopeless lamentation. "Murchison, this being, thing, whatever it is, no longer leaves me even for a moment. It will not stay here unless I am here, for it loves me, persistently, idiotically. It accompanied me to Paris, stayed with me there, pursued me to the lecture hall, pressed against me, caressed me while I was speaking. It has returned with me here. It is here now." He uttered a sharp cry. "Now, as I sit here with you. It is nestling up to me, fawning upon me, touching my hands. Man, can't you feel that it is here?" "No," the father answered truthfully. "I try to protect myself from its loathsome contact," Guildea continued, with fierce excitement, clutching the thick rug with both hands. "But nothing is of any avail against it. Nothing. What is it? What can it be? Why should it have come to me that night?" "Perhaps as a punishment," said the father, with a quick softness. "For what?" "You hated affection. You put human feelings aside with contempt. You desired to have no love for anyone, nor did you desire to receive any love from anything. Perhaps this is a punishment." Guildea stared into his face. "Do you believe that?" he cried. "I don't know," said the father, "but it may be so. Try to endure it, even to welcome it. Possibly then the persecution will cease." "I know it means me no harm," Guildea exclaimed. "It seeks me out of affection. It was led to me by some amazing attraction which I exercise over it ignorantly. I know that. But to a man of my nature, that is the ghastly part of the matter. If it would hate me, I could bear it. If it would attack me, if it would try to do me some dreadful harm, I should become a man again. I should be braced to fight against it. But this gentleness, this abominable solicitude, this brainless worship of an idiot, persistent, sickly, horribly physical, I cannot endure. What does it want of me? What would it demand of me? It nestles to me. It leans against me. I feel its touch like the touch of a feather, trembling about my heart, as if it sought to number my pulsations, to find out the inmost secrets of my impulses and desires. No privacy is left to me." He sprang up excitedly. "I cannot withdraw," he cried. "I cannot be alone, untouched, unworshipped, unwatched for even 1/2 second. Murchison, I am dying of this. I am dying." He sank down again in his chair, staring apprehensively on all sides, with the passion of some blind man, deluded in the belief that by his furious and continued effort he will attain sight. The father knew well that he sought to pierce the veil of the invisible, and have knowledge of the thing that loved him. "Guildea," the father said, with insistent earnestness, "try to endure this. Do more, try to give this thing what it seeks." "But it seeks my love." "Learn to give it your love, and it may go, having received what it came for." "You talk as a priest. Suffer your persecutors. Do good to them that despitefully use you. You talk as a priest." "As a friend I spoke naturally. Indeed, right out of my heart. The idea suddenly came to me that all this, truth or seeming, it doesn't matter which, may be some strange form of lesson. I have had lessons, painful ones. I shall have many more. If you could welcome—" "I can't! I can't!" Guildea cried fiercely. "Hatred! I can give it that. Always that. Nothing but that. Hatred! Hatred!" He raised his voice, glared into the emptiness of the room, and repeated, "Hatred!" As he spoke, the waxen pallor of his cheeks increased until he looked like a corpse with living eyes. The father feared that he was going to collapse and faint, but suddenly he raised himself upon his chair and said, in a high and keen voice, full of suppressed excitement, "Murchison! Murchison!" "Yes, what is it?" An amazing ecstasy shone in Guildea's eyes. "It wants to leave me," he cried. "It wants to go. Don't lose a moment. Let it out. The window, the window." The father, wondering, went to the near window, drew aside the curtains and pushed it open. The branches of the trees in the garden creaked dryly in the light wind. Guildea leaned forward on the arms of his chair. There was silence for a moment. Then Guildea, speaking in a rapid whisper, said, "No, no. Open this door. Open the hall door. I feel that it will return the way it came. Make haste. Ah, go." The father obeyed. To soothe him, hurried to the door and opened it wide. Then he glanced back at Guildea. He was standing up, bent forward. His eyes were glaring with eager expectation. And as the father turned, he made a furious gesture towards the passage with his thin hands. The father hastened out and down the stairs. As he descended in the twilight, he fancied he heard a slight cry from the room behind him. But he did not pause. He flung the hall door open, standing back against the wall. After waiting a moment to satisfy Guildea he was about to close the door again, and had his hand on it, when he was attracted irresistibly to look forth towards the park. The night was lit by a young moon, and gazing through the railings, his eyes fell upon a bench beyond them. Upon this bench something was sitting, huddled together very strangely. The father remembered instantly Guildea's description of that former night, that night of Advent, and a sensation of horror-stricken curiosity stole through him. Was there then really something that had indeed come to the Professor, and had it finished its work, fulfilled its desire, and gone back to its former existence? The father hesitated a moment in the doorway. Then he stepped out resolutely and crossed the road, keeping his eyes fixed on this black or dark object that leaned so strangely upon the bench. He could not tell yet what it was like, but he fancied it was unlike anything with which his eyes were acquainted. He reached the opposite path and was about to pass through the gate in the railings, when his arm was brusquely grasped. He started, turned round, and saw a policeman eyeing him suspiciously. "What are you up to?" said the policeman. The father was suddenly aware that he had no hat upon his head, and that his appearance, as he stole forward in his cassock, with his eyes intently fixed upon the bench in the park, was probably unusual enough to excite suspicion. "It's all right, policeman," he answered quickly, thrusting some money into the constable's hand. Then, breaking from him, the father hurried towards the bench, bitterly vexed at the interruption. When he reached it, nothing was there. Guildea's experience had been almost exactly repeated, and filled with unreasonable disappointment, the father returned to the house, entered it, shut the door, and hastened up the narrow stairway into the library. On the hearthrug, close to the fire, he found Guildea lying with his head lolled against the armchair from which he had recently risen. There was a shocking expression of terror on his convulsed face. On examining him, the father found that he was dead. The doctor, who was called in, said that the cause of death was failure of the heart. When Father Murchison was told this, he murmured, "Failure of the heart. It was that, then." He turned to the doctor and said, "Could it have been prevented?" The doctor drew on his gloves and answered, "Possibly, if it had been taken in time. Weakness of the heart requires a great deal of care. The Professor was too much absorbed in his work. He should have lived very differently." The father nodded. "Yes, yes," he said sadly. End of section 20. Section 21 of Tongues of Conscience by Robert Hitchens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Reichert. The Lady and the Beggar. Nothing in life is more rare than the conversion of a person who is close about money into one generous, open-handed, and lavish. The sparrow will sooner become the peacock than the miser the spendthrift. And if this is so, if such a transformation seldom occurs in life, it is even more unusual for a man or woman to leave behind, in dying, a manifesto which contradicts in set terms the obvious and universally recognized tendency of their whole existence. Naturally, therefore, the provisions of Mrs. Errington's will surprised the world. Old gentlemen in clubs stared upon the number of the Illustrated London News, which announced the disposal of her money as they might have stared upon the head of Medusa. The fidgety seemed turned to stone as they read. The thoughtless gaped. As for the thoughtful, this will drove them to deep meditation and set them walking in a maze of surmises from which they found no outlet. One or two, religiously inclined, recalled that saying concerning the rich individual and the passage of a camel through a needle's eye. Possibly it had come home to Mrs. Errington upon her deathbed. Possibly, as her end drew near, she had perceived herself tower to camel size, the entrance to paradise shrink to the circumference which refuses to receive a thread manipulated by an unsteady hand. Yes, they began to expand in unctuous conjecture that merged into deliberate assertion, when someone remarked that Mrs. Errington had died in exactly 3 minutes of the rupture of a blood vessel on the brain. So this comfortable theory was exploded. And no other seemed tenable. No other explained the fact that this wealthy woman, notorious during her life for her miserly disposition, her neglect of charity, her curious hatred of the poor, and complete emancipation from the tender shackles of philanthropy, bequeathed at death the greater part of her fortune to the destitute of London, and to the honest beggars whom fate persistently castigates, whom even labour declines to accept as toilers at the meanest wage. Only Horace Errington, the dead woman's sole child, and Captain Hindford of the Life Guards, exactly knew the truth of the matter. And this truth was so strange, and must have seemed so definite a lie to the majority of mankind, that it was never given to the world. Not even the rescued poor who found themselves received into the Errington home, as into some heaven with 4 beautiful walls, knew why there had sprung up such a home and why they were in it. The whole affair was discussed ardently at the time, argued about, contested, and dropped. Mystery veiled it. Like many things that happen, it remained an inexplicable enigma to the world, and finally the world forgot it. But Horace Errington remembered it, more especially when he heard light-hearted people merrily laughing at certain strange shadows of things unseen which will at times intrude into the most frivolous societies, turning the meditative to thoughts deep as dark and silent flowing rivers, the careless to frisky sneers, and the gibes which fly forth in flocks from the dense undergrowths of ignorance. The Erringtons were magnets and irresistibly attracted gold instead of steel. Mr. Errington died comparatively young, overwhelmed by the benefits showered upon him by fortune, which continued to dog persistently the steps of his widow, whom he left with one child, Horace. This boy was destined by his father's will to be a millionaire, and had no need of any money from his mother, so that eventually Mrs. Errington did him no wrong by the bequest which so troubled the curious. She was a brilliant and an attractive woman, sparkling as a diamond, and apparently as hard. That she loved Horace there was no doubt, and he had adored her. Yet he could not influence her as most only sons can influence their mothers. She was liberally gifted with powers of resistance, and in all directions opposed impenetrable barriers to the mental or spiritual assaults of those with whom she came in contact. It seemed impossible for Mrs. Errington to receive, like a waxen tablet, a definite impression. She was so completely herself that she walked the world as one clad in armour which turned aside all weapons. This might have been partly the reason why men found her so attractive, partly, also, the reason why Horace considered her, even while he was not yet acquainted with trousers, as so very wonderful among women. Among many indifferences, Mrs. Errington included a definite indifference to the sufferings of those less fortunate than herself. Legacies came to her as often as mendicants to Victor Hugo's Bishop of D. She received them with a quiet greediness so prettily concealed at first that nobody called it vulgar. As time went on, this greediness grew to gluttony. Mrs. Errington began to feel that fatal influence which came upon the man who built walls with his gold, and each day longed to see the walls rise higher around him. A passion for mere possession seized her and dominated her. Even she permitted the world, always curiously nosing, like a dog in people's gutters, to become aware of this passion. This beautifully dressed, gay and clever woman was known to be an eager miser, by her acquaintance first, and last by her own son Horace. It is true that she spent money on the so-called good things of life, gave admirable dinners, and would as soon have gone without clothes as without her opera box. But she practised an intense economy in many secret and some public ways, and more especially she was completely deaf to those appeals of suffering and sometimes of charlatanry which besiege our ears in London, so full of wily outcasts and of those who are terribly in need. Mrs. Errington's name figured in no charitable lists. She seldom even gave her patronage to a bazaar, and, above all things, she positively abhorred the beggars who make the streets and parks their hunting grounds, who hover before doorsteps and grow up from the ground like mustard seeds, when a luggage-laden cab stops or a carriage unblessed with a groom pauses before a shop. Horace knew this hatred very well, so well that, although his nature was as lavish as his mother's was mean, he seldom sought to rouse any pity in her pitiless heart, or to strike the rock from which experience had taught him that no water would gush out. Every habit of conduct is, however, broken through now and then, when the moment is exceptional and the soul is deeply stirred. And this reticent mood of the boy, when his mother one day received a shock which drove him into a contest with her, and moved him to strive against the obedience which his love for her habitually imposed upon him. It was springtime. Horace, now 16 and long established at Eton, was at home for the Easter vacation, which he was spending with Mrs. Errington, not at their country place, but in her town house in Park Lane. One morning, when the city was smiling with sunshine, and was so full of the breath of the sweet season that in quiet corners it seemed in some strange and indefinite way almost countrified, Horace went into Mrs. Errington's boudoir and begged her to come out for a walk in the park, where he had already been bicycling before breakfast. When there was no question of money, she was always ready to accede to any request of the boy's, and she got up at once from her writing table. She was just sending a short note of refusal to subscribe to some charity pressed upon her attention by a hopeful clergyman, and went to her room to put on her hat. 5 minutes later she and Horace set forth. Weather may have a softening or a hardening influence on the average person. On Mrs. Errington it had neither. She felt much the same essentially in a thunderstorm or in midsummer moonlight, on a black frost-bound winter's day, or on such a perfect and tender spring morning as that on which she now passed through the park gate with her son. She never drew weather into her soul, but calmly recognized it as a fact suitable for illustration on the first page of the Daily Graphic. Now she walked gaily into the Row with Horace, looking about her for acquaintances. She found some, and would not have been sorry to linger with them, but Horace wanted her to go further afield, and accordingly they soon moved on towards the Serpentine. It was when they were just in sight of the water that they met Captain Hindford, already alluded to as a man who had eventually more knowledge than other people of the events which led to the drawing up of Mrs. Errington's strange will. He was one of the many men who admired Mrs. Errington, while wondering at her narrow and excommunicative disposition, and he stopped to speak to her with the eager readiness which is so flattering to a woman. The spring, so much discussed, was lightly discussed again, and by some inadvertence, no doubt, Captain Hindford, who was almost as genial as if he had lived in the days of Dickens, was led to exclaim, "By Jove, Mrs. Errington, this first sunshine's as seductive as a pretty child. Makes one ready to do anything. Why, I saw an old crossing sweeper just now sweeping nothing at all, for it's as dry as a bone, you see, and I had to fork out a sixpence. Encouraged useless industry just because of the change in the weather, 'pon my word, eh?" Mrs. Errington's lips tightened ever so little. "A great mistake, Captain Hindford," she said dryly. Horace looked at his mother with a sort of bright, boyish curiosity. Although he knew so well what her nature was like, it did not cease to surprise him. "You think so?" said the captain. "Well, perhaps you're right. I don't know. Daresay I've been a fool. Still, you know, a fool in sunshine is better than a wise man in a fog. 'Pon my word, yes, eh?" Mrs. Errington did not verbally agree, and they parted after the captain had accepted an invitation to dine quietly in Park Lane that evening. "Devilish odd woman, devilish odd," was Hindford's comment, and he watched the mother's and son's retreating figures with a certain astonishment. "Wonder what the boy thinks of her," he muttered. "Jove, if there isn't a beggar going after them. She'll soon settle him." And he remained standing to watch the encounter. From where he stood he had seen the beggar, who had been half sitting, half lying on a bench facing the water, glance up at Mrs. Errington and her son as they passed, partially raise himself up, gaze after them, and finally rise to his feet and follow their footsteps. Hindford could only see the man's back. It was long, slightly bending, and apparently youngish. A thin but scrupulously neat coat of some poor shiny and black material covered it, and hung from the man's shoulders loosely, forming two folds which were almost like two gently rounded hills, with a shallow valley running between them up to the blades of the shoulders. Certainly the coat didn't fit very well. The captain watched, expecting to see this beggar address an appeal to Mrs. Errington or Horace. But apparently the man was nervous or half-hearted, for he followed them slowly, without catching them up, until the trio vanished from view on the bank of the Serpentine. When this disappearance took place, the captain was conscious of an absurd feeling of disappointment. He could not understand why he felt any anxiety to see Mrs. Errington refuse a beggar alms, yet he would gladly have followed, like a spy, to behold a commonplace and dingy event. Despite the apparent reluctance of the beggar to ply his trade, Hindford that presently the man would approach Mrs. Errington and be promptly sent about his business. Her negative would, no doubt, be eager enough, even upon this exquisite and charitable morning. Wishing devoutly that, being a gentleman, he had not to conform to an unwritten code of manners, Hindford walked away. And as he walked, he saw continually the back of the beggar with his black coat of the two hills and the valley between the shoulder blades. Meanwhile, Mrs. Errington and Horace, quite unaware that they were being followed, pursued their way. There was a few boats out on the water, occupied by inexpert oarsmen whose frantic efforts to seem natural and serene in this to them new and complicated art drew the undivided attention of the boy, a celebrated wet bob. Mrs. Errington was thinking about her latest investments and watching the golden walls grow higher about her. Mother and son were engrossed, and did not hear a low voice say, "I beg your pardon," until it had uttered the words more than once. Then Horace looked round. He saw a tall and very pale young man, neatly though poorly dressed in dark trousers and a thin loose black coat that might have been made of alpaca and fitted badly. This man's face was gaunt and meagre, the features were pointed, the mouth was piteous. His eyes blazed with some terrible emotion, it seemed, and when Horace looked round, a sudden patch of scarlet burned on his white and bony cheeks. Horace's attention was pinned by his appearance, which was at the same time dull and piercing, as the human aspect becomes in the tremendous moment of an existence. This man's soul seemed silently screaming out in his glance, his posture, his chalk-white cheeks starred with scarlet spots, his long-fingered hands drooping down in the shadow of his ill-fitting coat, which fluttered in the breeze. Horace turned, looked, and stood still. The man also stood still. Mrs. Errington looked sharply round. "What is it, Horace?" she said. She glanced at the man, and her lips tightened. "Come along, Horace," she said. "Come!" But Horace, who seemed fascinated by the spectre that had claimed their attention, still hesitated, and the man, noticing this, half held out one hand and murmured in a husky voice, "I am starving." With the words, the scarlet spots in his cheeks deepened to a fiercer hue, and he hung his head like one abruptly overwhelmed with shame. "For God's sake, give me something," he muttered. I've never done this before." Horace's hand went to his waistcoat pocket, but before he could take out a coin, Mrs. Errington had decisively intervened. "Horace, I forbid you," she said. "Mater!" "Understand, I forbid you." She took his arm and they walked on, leaving the man standing by the waterside. He did not follow them or repeat his dismal statement, only let his head drop forward on his bosom, while his fingers twisted themselves convulsively together. Meanwhile, a hot argument was proceeding between Mrs. Errington and Horace. For once it seemed that the boy was inclined to defy his mother. "Let me give him something, only a few coppers," he said. "No, beggars ought not to be encouraged." "That chap isn't a regular beggar. I'll wager anything it's true. He is starving." "Nonsense, they always say so." "Mater, stop. I must—" Horace paused resolutely and looked round. In the distance the man could still be seen standing where they had left him, his head drooped, his narrow shoulders hunched slightly forward. "Let me run back," the boy went on. "I won't be a minute." But Mrs. Errington's curious parsimony was roused now to full activity. "I will not allow it," she said. "The man is probably a thief and a drunkard. Hyde Park swarms with bad characters. Bad character or not, he's starving. Anyone can see that." "Then let him starve. It's his own fault. Let him starve. Nobody need unless they have committed some folly, or worse, some crime. There's bread enough for all who deserve to live. I have no sympathy with all this preposterous pauperizing which goes by the name of charity. It's a fad, a fashion, nothing more." She forced her son to walk on. As they went, he cast a last glance back at the beggar. "Mater, you're cruel," he said, moved by a strength of emotion that was unusual in him. "Hard and cruel." Mrs. Errington made no reply. She had gained her point and cared for little else. "You'll repent this some day," Horace continued. He was in a passion, and scarcely knew what he was saying. Strings seemed drawn tightly round his heart, and angry tears rose to his eyes. "You'll repent it, I bet," he added. Then he relapsed into silence, feeling that if he spoke again, he would lose all the self-control that a boy of 16 thinks so much of. All that day Horace thought incessantly of the beggar, and felt an increasing sense of anger against his mother. He found himself looking furtively at her, as one looks at a stranger, and thinking her face hard and pitiless. She seemed to him as someone whom he had never really known till now, as someone whom, now that he knew her, he feared. Why his mind dwelt so perpetually upon a casual beggar, he couldn't understand. But so it was. He saw perpetually the man's white face, fierce and ashamed eyes, the gesture at once hungry and abashed with which he asked for charity. All day the vision haunted the boy in the sunshine. Mrs. Errington, on her part, calmly ignored the incident of the morning, and appeared not to notice any change in her son's demeanour. In the evening Captain Hindford came to dine. He was struck by Horace's glumness, and in his frank way openly chaffed the boy about it. "What's up with this young scoundrel?" he said to Mrs. Errington. Horace grew very red. "Horace is not very well to-day," said his mother. "Mater, that's not true. I'm all right." "I think it more charitable to suppose you seedy," she replied. "Charitable!" Horace cried. "Well, Mater, what on earth do you know about charity?" Captain Hindford began to look embarrassed, and endeavoured to change the subject. But Horace suddenly burst out into the story of the beggar. "It was just after you left us," he said to the captain. "I saw the fellow following you," the captain said. Then he turned to Mrs. Errington. "These chaps are the plague of the park," he added. "Exactly. That's what I tell Horace." "I don't care," the boy said stoutly. "He was starving, and we were brutes not to give him something. The mater'll be sorry for it some day. I know it. I can feel it." Captain Hindford began to talk about French plays rather hastily. When Mrs. Errington went up to the drawing-room, Horace suddenly said to the captain, "I say, Hindford, do me a good turn to-night, will you?" "Well, old chap, what is it, eh?" "When you say good night, don't really go." The captain looked astonished. "But—" he began. "Wait outside a second for me. When the mater's gone to bed, I want you to come into the park with me." "The park? What for?" "To find that Beggar chap. I bet he's there. Lots of his sort sleep there, you know. I want to give him something, and somehow I'd like you to come with me. Besides, it doesn't do to go looking for anyone in the park alone at night." "That's true," the captain said. "All right, Errington, I'll come." And after bidding Mrs. Errington good night, he lingered in Park Lane till he was joined by Horace. They turned at once into the park and began to make their way in the direction of the Serpentine. It was a soft night, full of the fine and minute rain that belongs especially to spring weather. The clocks of the town had struck 11, and most of the legitimate sweethearts who make the park their lovers' walk had gone home, leaving this realm of lawns and trees and waters to the night-birds, the pickpockets, the soldiers, and the unhealthily curious persons over whom it exercises such a continual and gloomy fascination. Hindford and Horace could have seen many piteous sights had they cared to, as they walked down the long path by the Row. The boy peered at each seat as they passed, and once or twice hesitated by some thin and tragic figure, stretched in uneasy slumber or bowed in staring reverie, face to face with the rainy night. But from each in turn he drew back, occasionally followed by a muttered oath or a sharp ejaculation. "I bet he'll be somewhere by the Serpentine," the boy said to Hindford. And they walked on till at length they reached the black sheet of water closely muffled in the night. "We met him somewhere just here," Horace said. "I know," Hindford rejoined. "He got up from this seat, but he may be a dozen miles off by now." "No," Horace said with a curious pertinacity. "I'm sure he's about here still. He looked like a man with no home. Oh, how dreary it is. Come along, Hindford." The good-natured captain obeyed, and they went on by the cheerless water, which was only partially revealed in the blackness. Suddenly they both stopped. "What's that?" Horace exclaimed. A shrill whistle, followed by shouts, came to them, apparently from the water. Then there was an answering whistle from somewhere in the park. "It's the police," said Hindford. "There's something up." They hurried on, and in a moment saw what looked like a great black shadow rising out of the water, lifting in its arms another shadow, which drooped and hung down with little waves curling round it. As they drew close they saw that the first shadow was a policeman, up to his waist in the water, and the second shadow was a man whom he held in his arms, as he waded with difficulty to the shore. "Lend a hand, mates," he shouted as he saw them. Just then a light shone out over the black lake from the bull's-eye of a second policeman, who had hurried up in answer to his comrade's whistle. Between them they quickly got the man on shore, and laid him down on the path on his back. The bull's-eye lantern, turned full on him, lit up a face that seemed all bony structure, staring eyes, a mouth out of which the water dripped. He had no coat on, and his thin arms were like those of a skeleton. "Dead as a doornail," said the first policeman. "A case of suicide." "God! Hindford, it's he! It's the chap who asked me for money this morning," whispered Horace. "Is he really dead?" The captain, who had been examining the body and feeling the heart, nodded. Horace gazed upon the white face with a sort of awful curiosity. He had never before looked at a corpse. "Look here, Errington," Hindford said to the boy that night as he parted from him in Park Lane. "Don't tell your mother anything of this." But Hindford—" "Come now, you take my advice. Keep a quiet tongue in your head." "But perhaps it was her fault. It was. If we'd given the poor chap something, he'd—" "Probably. That's just the reason I don't want you to tell Mrs. Errington anything of it. Come, promise me on your honour." "All right, Hindford, I'll promise. How horrible it's all been." "Don't think about it, lad. Good night." Horace trembled as he stole up the black staircase to bed. He meant to keep his promise, of course, but he wondered whether the mater would have owned that she was in the wrong that morning if she had heard his dreary tale of the beggar's death in the night. The next day it was Mrs. Errington who asked Horace to go out walking. She looked rather pale and fatigued at breakfast, but declared her intention of taking a constitutional. "Come with me, Horace," she said. "Very well," he answered with a curious and almost shy boyish coldness. "Not into the park, Mater," he said as they were starting. "Why not? We always walk there. Where else should we go?" "Anywhere. Shopping. Regent Street." "No, Horace. I've got a headache to-day. I want a quiet place." He didn't say more. They set out, and Mrs. Errington took the precise route they had followed the day before. She glanced rather sharply about her as they walked. Presently they reached the seat on which the beggar had been sitting just before he got up to follow them. Mrs. Errington paused beside it. "I'm tired. Let us sit down here," she said. "No, Mater, not there." "Really, Horace," Mrs. Errington said, "you are in an extraordinary mood to-day. You have no regard for me. What is the matter with you?" And she sat down on the seat. Horace remained standing. "I shan't sit here," he said obstinately. "Very well," Mrs. Errington replied. She really began to look ill, but Horace was too much preoccupied with his own feelings to notice it. There was something abominable to him in his mother sitting calmly down to rest in the very place occupied a few hours ago by the wretched creature who had, so Horace believed, been driven to death by her refusal of charity. He felt sick with horror in that neighbourhood, and he moved away and stood staring across the Serpentine. Presently Mrs. Errington called to him in a faint voice, "Horace, come and give me your hand." He turned, noticed her extreme pallor, and ran up. "What's the row? Are you ill, Mater?" "No, help me up." He put out his hand. She got up slowly. "We'll go home," he said. "You look awfully seedy." "No, let us walk on." In spite of his remonstrances, she insisted on walking up and down on the edge of the Serpentine for quite an hour. She appeared to be on the lookout for somebody. Over and over again they passed the spot where the beggar had drowned himself. Their feet tread over the ground on which his dead body had been laid. Each time they reached it, Horace felt himself grow cold. Death is so terrible to the young. At last Mrs. Errington stopped. "I can't walk much more," she said. "Then do let's go home now," Horace said. She stood looking round her, searching the park with her eyes. "I suppose we must," she said slowly. Then she added, "We can come here again to-morrow." Horace was puzzled. "What for? Why should we?" he asked. But his mother made no reply, and they walked home. Next day she insisted on going again to the same place, and again she was obviously on the lookout. Horace grew more and more puzzled by her demeanour. And when the third day came, and once more Mrs. Errington called him to set forth to the Serpentine, he said to her, with a boy's bluntness, "Do you want to meet someone there?" Mrs. Errington looked at him strangely. "Yes," she said after a minute's silence. "Why, who is it?" "That beggar I wouldn't let you give money to." Horace turned scarlet with the shock of surprise and the knowledge, which he absolutely felt as guilty knowledge, that the man was dead, perhaps even buried by now. "Oh, nonsense, Mater," he began, stammering. "He won't come there again. Besides, you never give to beggars." "I mean to give this man something." Horace was more and more surprised. "Why?" he exclaimed. "Why now? You wouldn't when I wanted you to, and now it's too late. What do you wish to give to him for now?" But all she would say was, "I feel that I should like to. That his perhaps really was a deserving case. Come, Horace, let us go and try to find him." And the boy, bound by his word to Captain Hindford, was forced to go out in search of a dead man. He felt the horror of this quest. To-day Mrs. Errington carried her purse in her hand and looked eagerly out for the beggar. Once she fancied she saw him in the distance. "There he is!" she cried to Horace. "Run and fetch him!" The boy turned pale and stared. "Where, Mater?" "Among those trees." "It can't be. Nonsense." "No," she said, "you're right. I made a mistake. It's only somebody like him. Why, Horace, what's the matter?" "Nothing," he answered, but he was shaking. The business was too ghastly. He felt he couldn't stand it much longer, and he resolved to go to Captain Hindford and persuade the captain to absolve him from his promise. In the afternoon of the same day, accordingly, he went off to Knightsbridge. He rang and was told that Captain Hindford had gone to Paris and was afterwards going for a tour on the Continent. His heart sank at the news. Was he to go on day after day, searching with his mother for this corpse, which was rotting in the grave? He asked for Hindford's address. It was Poste Restante, Monte Carlo, but the servant added that letters sent there might have to wait 2 or 3 days, as his master's immediate plans were unsettled. Horace, however, went to the nearest telegraph office and wired to Hindford. "Let me off promise. Urgent. Horace Errington." Then, having done all he could, he went back to Park Lane. He found his mother in a curiously restless state, and directly he came in she began to talk about the beggar. "I must and will find that man," she said. "Mater, why?" "Because I shall never be well till I do," she said. "I don't know what it is, but I cannot be still by day, and I cannot rest by night, for thinking of him. Why did I not let you give him something?" "Mater, I wish to God you had," the boy said solemnly. Mrs. Errington did not seem to notice his unusual manner. She was self-engrossed. "However, we shall see him again, no doubt," she went on, "and then I shall give him something handsome. I know he needs it." Horace went hastily out of the room. He longed for a wire from Captain Hindford. Next day he shammed ill, as he called it to himself, so as to get out of going into the park. So Mrs. Errington went off by herself, in a condition of almost feverish anticipation. "I know I shall see him to-day," she said as she left Horace. She returned at lunch-time and came up at once to his room. "I have seen him," she said. Horace sat up, staring at her in blank amazement. "What, Mater? What do you say?" "I have seen him." "No?" "Yes. I went to the place where he asked you for money, and walked up and down for ages, but he wasn't there. At last I gave it up and crossed the bridge. I took it into my head to come home on the other side of the water. Well, when I was halfway along it, I looked across and there I saw him." "Rot, Mater." "He was standing alone by the water, staring straight across at me, just as if he saw me and was trying to attract my attention." "No, no." "Horace, don't be silly. Why do you contradict me? He looked just the same as when we saw him first, only he had no coat on." Horace gave a sort of gasp. "I suppose his poverty had compelled him to pawn it," Mrs. Errington continued. "Don't you think so, Horace? People can pawn clothes, can't they?" The boy nodded. His eyes were fixed on her. "I looked across at him," Mrs. Errington continued, "and made a sign to him to come round to meet me on the other end, near the row. I held up my purse so that he might understand me." "What did he do?" "He turned away and hurried off among the trees." "Oh." "Do you know, Horace," Mrs. Errington continued rather excitedly, "I think if you had beckoned to him he would have come. He's afraid of me, perhaps, because I wouldn't let you give to him. To-morrow you must come out with me. Till I've relieved that man's wants I shall have no peace." She hastened out of the room, apparently in a quiver of unusual agitation. Horace sat petrified. If only Hindford would telegraph. That cursed promise. On the following day it rained. Nevertheless, Mrs. Errington almost violently insisted upon Horace accompanying her to search for the beggar. "We shall go to the far side of the water," she said. "I believe when we go to the other side he sees us coming and avoids us. But if we can catch sight of him, as I did yesterday, you can beckon to him, and I am certain when he sees you he will come." Horace said nothing. He felt cold about the heart, not so much with fear as with awe and wonder. They went to the far bank, and almost directly Mrs. Errington cried out, "There he is, and without his coat again! How wet he must be getting!" Horace looked across the dull water through the driving rain. He saw no one on the opposite bank. "He sees us," Mrs. Errington added. "Horace, you beckon to him. Here, take my purse. Hold it up, and then point to him to come round and meet us." Mechanically the boy obeyed. "Oh, I knew it! This time he's coming," said Mrs. Errington. "He is coming, Mater?" "Yes, come along." She hurried towards the end of the Serpentine. Horace walked by her side, staring in horror through the rain. "Poor man," Mrs. Errington said presently. "How ghastly he looks. Mater, I say — well? Is he near?" "Near?" Mrs. Errington stopped in amazement. "Why, what do you mean, Horace?" "What I say. Is he near now?" "Near? He's just coming up." Suddenly the boy fainted. When he came to, he was lying in the shelter of the Rescue Society. "Oh, Horace," his mother said, "you ought to have stayed in bed another day." "Yes, Mater." "You frightened that poor man. He made off when you fainted." That evening Horace received a telegram from Monte Carlo. "Very well, but better say nothing. Hindford." He read it, laid it down, and told Mrs. Errington the truth. As already stated, she died very suddenly not long afterwards, leaving behind her the will which so astonished London. End of Section 21. End of Tongues of Conscience by Robert Hichens.